Okay, so welcome back to our discussions. This is a time period that Americans like to study quite a bit because it seems like such a fun time to be alive in America. It's referred to as the happy days of the 1950s, but many historians refer to it as the age of conformity. And the reason for that is that the American people, for the most part, wanted to all belong together. They had survived the Depression and World War II, two of the most unbelievable calamities to befall the United States in its history. And by pulling together and by looking out for one another, they became successful. So, part of the discussion today is going to be about those sentiments and what it really meant to be an American in the 1950s. One could also look at the 1950s as yet another era of good feelings. On the surface, everything looks great. There's high patriotism, there's prosperity, the country is growing in power and influence. But underneath the surface, there are problems, and problems that need to be dealt with, but aren't necessarily being dealt with in the way that gives them their due. And so the time period of the 50s can really be seen from either angle, depending on your perspective. And so when we go forward with this, I just want to remind everybody that you can get these lectures off of Canvas by going into the various modules, not the ones that I set up away from it, but you'll see that there's different areas where you can get video of these speeches and lectures that are offered, not just by our authors, but some of the leading thinkers in these areas. So in 1945, the United States and Soviet Union emerged as the two most powerful nations in the world. Having been allies in defeating Nazism, they were very quick enemies, mostly because of violations of Yalta. And so for the United States, the Cold War was going to be yet another confrontation that pulled the United States out of its isolation. And for better or worse, it's a turning point that we've never returned from. America today is very much a part of the world, and the role of the United States globally is a blessing and a curse in many ways. So for Eisenhower, moderate republicanism was his sort of theme. We sometimes talk about the Eisenhower years as the middle way presidency. And in many ways, if you'll remember, I talked in the previous lecture about how the United States leadership, and what I mean by leadership is Congress and members of the military officer corps and whatnot, had come to what is referred to as the post-war consensus, this idea that that as long as the domestic programs ran on Keynesianism and the foreign policy ran on containment, that there was going to be broad consensus to support it. And a lot of older political figures today who lament the quote-unquote good old days of government are probably reminiscing of this very period, a time in which, for the most part, this World War II generation could come to terms with one another regardless of the fact that they were Democrat or Republican. And so here we have the first Republican president elected since, in 20 years. And Ike, as he was known, believed that the most important power of the president was that of persuasion. While this had given him an appearance of a do-nothing president, recent scholarship has revealed that he played more of a role than what was thought at the time. Ike called his domestic program dynamic conservatism, in that it was conservative when spending money and liberal when it came to human beings. He kept the basic framework of the New Deal, but reduced many of the previous Democratic presidents' social programs. Perhaps the greatest monument to his administration was the federal aid for highway funding called the Highway Act. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But obviously it was a major planned deficit spending project that would have been very much in place in that New Deal programs. And so part of this forceful presence of Eisenhower, we kind of go into the McCarthyism, which I sort of touched on in the beginning. Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, owed his entire political fortunes to his role in quote-unquote hunting communists in the government. His first target was the State Department, which we talked about in the previous podcast, and that brought him a lot of national notoriety and even some international notoriety, and made him a very powerful player within the Republican Party. Eisenhower himself was encouraged to go after McCarthy, but in a quote that was accredited to him said that he would never go and get into the gutter with that guy. And so recent scholarship has unveiled what is referred to as the gloved fist of Eisenhower. Eisenhower is a former general, as we all know, and he was known to his men as a commander who praised in public but criticized in private. And his private meetings with people could be incredibly intimidating and daunting. He did not suffer fools gladly. And when he felt his orders were not obeyed, he could be rather colorful in his dialogue with you. And the story goes that Eisenhower traveled to McCarthy's home state of Wisconsin. And while there, arranged with his people to ensure that he was never close enough to McCarthy where there would be a photograph of the two of them together, which is one of those things that politicians like to do in their home states, to have pictures of the president chumming up with them and giving the appearance of sort of inside connections. And what happens, however, is that McCarthy was invited back to the president's offices. At this time, there was no Air Force One. There was, if you will, a train one. These were railroad cars that were connected to any of the trains traveling in the United States in which the president could travel. And McCarthy goes back, and the narrative that we get, which is a Republican one, tells of how McCarthy literally gets himself filleted alive. Eisenhower uses, let's just call it colorful language and very threatening language against McCarthy. And the reason for it was McCarthy had just gone through and purged through Hollywood and had demonized multiple people and getting them blacklisted, many of whom will never perform in the United States again, or do anything in the United States again. And he had now, in the 1950s, or specifically 1953 and 54, turned his attention to the Army. And this is Eisenhower's home. And even more specifically, he had gone off and tarnished the reputation of George Marshall, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II, and Eisenhower's boss. Well, many people, for a long time actually, criticized Eisenhower because he never seemed to come out in public to defend his old boss. But in this particular episode, a direct physical threat was made to Mr. McCarthy to back off, or it was going to be over. And what this episode did is it not only shook McCarthy to his core, but word of the episode started to percolate and stream through Republican circles. And within the year, McCarthy is going to be censured by the Senate. And this is going to be in December of 1954. Very few senators have been censured in the Senate. And what this was is McCarthy's forced to stand before the members of the Senate and essentially be told why the Senate felt that he was unfit to serve in his role. And this was quite literally the end of McCarthy's career. And in fact, within a few years after that, he dies of a heart attack, which was due in large part to his struggle with alcoholism. So So for Eisenhower, there was, after this brief post-war recession in 45 and 46, America quickly moved back into a boom economy. And Eisenhower was able to do this by securing Americans in the notion that now a general was in charge of America's foreign policy and security interests, and therefore could be trusted to handle any kind of emergencies that might occur. And therefore, the sort of hyper fear and anxiety that was produced by McCarthy could now go away, and people could concentrate on changing American leadership and going back to what Americans do best, which is to buy things. And so the election of 1952, as you can see from this graphic, is a pretty telling one. He wins 442 electoral votes to 89 and sweeps a great portion of the United States. But you will note, by the way, that the South remains strongly Democrat. It was still considered a sin, really, for a Southerner to vote Republican. And any of them that would be black voters who are now, at this point, being systemically disenfranchised in the South. So for the people of this period, right, the prosperity levels here are really unheard of. And for a lot of Americans who had still just recently gotten out of the clutches of the Great Depression, this was going to be quite a large post-war prosperity. And the consumer culture, which will rise to about 75% of the economy, is a large part of this. And it tied in with the GI Bill, which I talked about last podcast, but it was introduced to provide returning soldiers a form of support, a level of support in the form of loans for homes, education, business, unemployment benefits, and so on. And so for the first time, a great multitude had the financial capacity to earn a college degree. And this is a major impact on America's socioeconomic reality. For millions, literally millions of Americans, they are going to be the first generation to get a college degree. And a college degree at the time was going to mean a lot more than it does today. A bachelor's degree really meant an express ticket to prosperity, and it was going to be lifelong. Many of the men who returned from war and found themselves employed, particularly in corporate America, are going to live with the benefit of really only having one employer with a solid salary, pension, free health care, right? All the sorts of things that we now dream of. And it's been it's really been said by a number of economists, and especially economic historians, that our present day obsession with economic security and prosperity really stems from our really cognitive connection to the 1950s and early 60s, and this ideal that somehow this economic reality that we're studying in this chapter can somehow be recreated. And the statistical facts are, you don't want to recreate this period. The prosperity and the security that came in the 1950s came at the cost of the death of literally tens of millions of people, and most of them men. And the reason why there was so much employment opportunities for Americans returning from the war is that so many of their fellow Americans died in it. And so while it's admirable to desire the kinds of economic prosperity and security that existed in the 50s, it's really not a realistic thing to believe that it can come back, at least not to the degree it did then. And this prosperity and security meant that many of these 12 million or so veterans are going to come back and contribute to what we call the baby boom. Now, this is a socioeconomic impact and cultural impact that's really never been seen before in America. And I don't know if it's going to work visually for any of you, but we get this sort of demographic pig and a snake image. So when a snake swallows a pig whole, you're going to see that pig as it gets digested into that snake all the way through. And if you imagine the snake as a timeline coming up to the present day, the baby boomers, of which I am a member, with full disclosure, that when they were infants were the largest single demographic group in America, and the same when they were toddlers and teenagers and college kids and 30-somethings. At every stage in the baby boomers' lives, they were quite literally the center of attention. And what that meant was we've kind of become a very selfish and self-absorbed generation. And this has not bode well for a lot of the things that have happened in America. And we'll get into that a lot when we get into the future chapters. But the dynamics of American life changed with the onslaught of a new affordable products. So you see here in this 1959 advertisement for TV dinners, right? The whole idea of making America cheap and affordable and easy and convenient, right? And so with that comes America's love and obsession with suburbia, or what some of us might refer to as hell. So what we see here is, right, the Levitt brothers, right, the idea of suburban frontier, and Levittown, which is the picture here, was a New York developer. And he realized that you could mass produce houses just like you mass produce any other product. And so technological advances that had come about, and in part from experiences in the war, the Levitt brothers actually bought up farmland in Long Island and started to produce these cookie cutter homes. These homes that you see in this picture are literally identical with one another. And so these young families are going to find themselves in these Levitt towns. Now, for minorities, particularly African Americans, they are still on the move. There is another great migration that starts in the Second World War, with African Americans moving both into northern cities, but also into western cities as well, coming out west coast where I am in California. And with this migration comes a new reality that had been reflected in the 1920s, but now in the 1950s is really going to become quite demonstrative. And that is the Northern racism. And this is something that has been quite latent for a very long time in American history. In fact, when I teach the antebellum America in my early U.S. history course, I go through a conversation about how there's a tendency for Northerners to see themselves as the good guys, and how they fought against Southern racism. But the fact of the matter is, Northerners, Northerners tended to love the race but hate the people, and so. When Northerners became confronted with large population influxes into their cities, they responded negatively. And so while there were no sort of de jure examples of racism, meaning laws passed, de facto racism was very prevalent in the North. And so this was a unique problem, because unlike the South, where all public facilities, such as schools and municipal buildings and bathrooms and all this other stuff, were already separated in a segregated reality, Northern facilities were not. And so for Northerners who send their kids to public schools, we're now going to be confronted with black kids in school with their white children. And this is a big problem. And it's one that, in my opinion, many Northerners are still not coming to grips with. And so for many minorities, the prosperity that is spoken of in the 1950s doesn't quite reach them. There are areas of the economy where African Americans are going to dominate, whether it's mechanical work or maintenance work or supply type of work, especially in places like restaurants and whatnot. Corporate America was largely cut off to black workers. And so what you get in corporate life, however, is a very heavily military influence. And if you look at the corporate structures that existed, they had the same hierarchical order that you would have seen in military structures in the Second World War. And this is reflected in the fact that many of the corporate leaders that emerged in the 1950s were themselves veterans of the war. They were officers in large part. They came back, they took advantage of the GI Bill, they got their bachelor's degrees, and they went in and conquered corporate life and sort of superimposed the leadership structures of military life onto corporate life. And this was a very male-dominated order, still is in many respects. And what many people don't totally appreciate is the intense male sexual domination that was in this corporate structure. And for white males, this was not a picnic. These were heavy pressure, conformist environments where anything about you that showed you as different from everyone else, you were picked on, you were often bullied, you were pushed around by people who thought that they were superior to you. These were very hostile environments. If you ever read or see the play Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller, you begin to get an understanding of how life-threatening these environments were. And so this life was a very hostile one. And it's no wonder that as females and members of minorities become more and more integrated into these systems, that they're finding just how hostile they are and, sort of mistaking them as always about sexism or racism, when in reality it's just bastard behavior by a bunch of guys who are desperate to prove that they're stronger than everyone else. And so for women in the workplace, there are still areas that they dominate: nursing, teaching, secretarial positions. But these are all positions that paid less. They were all positions that were, in many people's minds, a temporary job pending a woman's marriage. So a lot of women would go to school for education, for teaching, for being a nurse, or going off to business schools for secretarial skills. And yet, when they got married, there was incredible amounts of pressure called the cult of domesticity that we've talked about before. There's this incredible pressure on them to leave and to commit their lives to one of being a mom and a wife. And this is a kind of pressure that is not done by law, but by culture and social norms that had existed long before. And so religion begins to play a role in the United States as well. And that has a lot to do with the notion that America's faith in the divine was perceived by many people to be a source of comfort and strength. And so now that we were going to confront a new menace, the Soviet Union, the communist bloc, we should turn again to the divine. And particularly because communists are atheists. And so there is an incredible spike in church attendance and synagogue attendance. People are going to join clubs, but one of these are going to be members of their parish, right? Actually, tithing members of their parish or their church. community. And this is very strong. And yet, the theological messages that are out there are not quite the same hellfire and brimstone that we've seen in previous great awakenings, as it were. The most heated, if you will, members of the clergy is going to be a very famous radio and then television evangelist named Billy Graham, who will emerge in the 1950s to become an incredibly influential pastor. In fact, he'll be called America's pastor. He will serve as a chaplain to pretty much all of the presidents from Eisenhower until George W. Bush, perhaps with the exception of John F. Kennedy. But this lineage is spread into other areas. The Reverend Norman Vincent Peale becomes very popular for his power of positive thinking. And then there is going to be the Bishop Robert Fulton Sheen, who will have a popular show in America that the millions and millions of Catholics will turn to for help and support. Now, the question then gets asked, what does this pressure to conform, this idea that everybody's going to be the same and we're all going to do the same thing, what does that do? It puts so much pressure on a culture and a society that eventually there is some form of rebellion. And this is what we refer to as the birth of the counterculture. Now, one of the reasons why we study it more now than we have in previous generations is that the baby boomers will be such a large part of this counterculture. And because they are the largest demographic group in the United States, it garners more attention, and it certainly wields a lot more influence. So the perils of conformity are really what you're going to think of. I mean, think about your own life and all the pressure that you feel on social media today. And this pressure existed then as well. This pressure to be like everyone else and to be happy in this role. And so this sense of alienation is very, very profound, not just with men or white men in these corporate structures, but African Americans who are, in a sense, being told, look at how good you have it, so now why don't you just shut up and enjoy your life? And for women to just basically go back to the home, give up all of the agency and status that you had gained during the war, and be a happy, contented wife and mother. And what do you do if you don't want to do those things? What becomes of you when you don't want to follow that norm? The most prescribed medication in the 50s is Valium, which is a precursor to Prozac, and it was predominantly given to women. And so when the Rolling Stones sing that she goes running for the shelter of mother's little helper, he's talking about this pill. And so it's a criticism of life in the post-war area, right? In terms of the complacency and the conformity that most Americans seem to have adopted. Some argued that cookie cutter approach to building houses in suburbs was indicative of this problem. So in literature and painting, we see this uprise of counter-cultural icons. And the preeminent one is going to be the beat community, which fostered in its members a frenzied desire to experience life in all of its intensity, including the cultural realm. So we get some mainstream authors like James Jones and John Updike and Ralph Ellison, who are going to commented on this modern American life and the rampant consumer culture that is, in many ways, destroying America's soul, if you will. So for the Beats, who are going to be led by Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, they are going to adopt these what are called streams of consciousness writing that was inspired and influenced by the transcendentalist writers of the 1800s, and most specifically Walt Whitman. And they are going to challenge these so-called norms that get produced in the 50s. That's going to then later inspire the youth of the 50s, who will then become the hippies of the 60s. So it has a cause and effect implication. In art, we get Jackson Pollock and Edward Hopper and Mark Rothko, and they led to a new form of painting that they believed illustrated the isolation of the average American in the post-war era. And so we get into things like abstract expressionism and pop art and other forms of expression. In the music realm, this is the birth of rock and roll. And, this again is an offshoot of jazz, really birthed through African American culture, namely Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Fats Domino and other Muddy Waters and all these other people who are going to be a big influence in rock and roll are coming from the black experience, particularly blues. And it takes off in the 50s, and the young baby boomers are going to latch onto this as their form of expression and rebellion. For the early years of the civil rights movement, hopefully I made it clear that there were some precedent setting in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s by the NAACP who wanted America to reflect the values that they were preaching to the rest of the world. So when Ike entered the White House, he was committed to civil rights in principle, and he worked to expand opportunities for minorities in federal agencies. In 1953, he appointed Earl Warren as Chief Justice to the Supreme Court. Warren, who was a former governor of California, would be instrumental during the civil rights movement. He moves the court into more of what we call an activist court, which is why Eisenhower said he regretted the appointment, because he felt that activists, which is a very sort of federalist philosophy on the court, forced Americans to deal with civil rights and racism in a way that was not going to be smooth or healthy. But more importantly, he believed that it was going to increase federal power vis-a-vis the states and create a stronger and more intrusive federal government. And so since the 1930s, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had worked to overturn separate but equal segregation rules in establishing these standards, right? So in 1950, in a case called Sweat versus Painter, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that separate but equal was not followed at the University of Texas and ordered the state to remedy it or allow African Americans to attend. Now, what this did is it leads to the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case in 1954. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation was no longer allowed, particularly when it involved education. Separate was inherently unequal, as the standard established in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896. And so the order went out, but a year later, when nothing was done, they ordered that it be done with all deliberate speed. Very few states acted on this order. So many southern cities had ordinances that required African Americans to be seated at the back of all public buses. In 1955, Rosa Parks, who's seen here on the left being arrested, refused to move to the back of the bus and was arrested. The city of Montgomery, Alabama organized a bus boycott the next night, led by Martin Luther King, who you see in the right. It lasted 381 days, and a year later, the protesters won a case in the Supreme Court that ruled that separate but equal treatment was no longer allowed in public transportation. So the Montgomery bus boycott becomes this, what many people feel as the starting point of the modern civil rights movement. So, now, there's going to be two Civil Rights Acts. Eisenhower supported the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1957, and in fact, it took Republican votes to ensure its passage because Southern Democrats essentially refused to do it. And it created a Civil Rights Commission in the Department of Justice. Due to the lack of enforcement power in this bill, it was not as successful as African Americans would have liked. But it did lay the foundation for future legislation. Its successor in 1960 required federal courts to register African Americans. it too lacked the teeth to be enforced, and registration was mostly involving their right to vote. In 1957, the governor of Arkansas mobilized the National Guard to prevent 9 African American students from entering Little Rock High School, as decreed by a federal court. When the confrontation turned violent, as you'll see here in this picture, the so-called Little Rock Nine were being terrorized, and that's just really the only thing I can use as a word, right? As you can see here, 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford is enduring the hostile screams of a racist crowd from her future classmates as she entered the high school. And what happened was Eisenhower had to make a decision about what to do, and he sent 1,000 soldiers to Little Rock to challenge the governor's order to keep whites out of the school. And for an entire year, each of these Little Rock 9 students were escorted by armed officers of the United States Army so that they could go to school. There's nothing that I can think of, that I can imagine in my farthest parts of my brain, how one can learn when that is your daily reality. And yet all 9 of these kids finished school. And it's just a testament to the perseverance. So the desegregation at Little Rock was the, I guess, maybe the warning shot from the federal government that this persistent resistance was no longer going to be acceptable in the United States. So now we're going to shift to foreign policy. And the United States had a perpetual problem with our war in North Korea. As I stated in the previous podcast, Truman felt incredible pressure to respond to communist infiltrations after the fall of China. So when North Korea invaded South Korea and almost wiped it off the map, Truman felt compelled to act. But by 1952, Korea was in a stalemate, and there was no end in sight. Part of Eisenhower's, let's call it, campaign pledge was that he himself would go to Korea and come to a resolution on that issue. And so the Korean War became the primary focus of the government. Eisenhower goes, talks to his generals, particularly General Ridgway, who was commander of all forces there. And he made this comment to the press that was a, let's say, not so veiled threat. In it, he said that if a resolution cannot be made at Panmunjom, which is where the peace negotiations were taking place, then he would allow his military to use any means necessary to settle this conflict, which, you know, in an era where the United States had a nuclear monopoly, this was a rather ominous statement for the president to make. This did happen. He ordered increased aerial bombardment, and negotiations soon commenced. And by July of 1953, we have what's called an armistice. And what many people don't realize is that the Korean War is still happening. In fact, the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un is basically building nuclear weapons as a way of extorting the United States into negotiating a peace treaty, which would recognize North Korea's right to exist as a sovereign, separate nation. So Eisenhower's Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles. He believed that the containment theory of the Truman administration was needlessly defensive, and he desired the United States to shift toward removing Soviet presence in Eastern Europe and other parts of the world where they had encroached on, quote unquote, free territories. Dulles promoted a policy known as brinksmanship, in which the United States would be willing to, quote unquote, go to the brink of nuclear war in order to confront communism. John Foster Dulles' brother, Allen Dulles, took over a new agency of the federal government. So which was the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. This came from a World War II agency within the Army called the Office of Special Services. And so concern over the regimes of some newly independent nations following World War II, in this sort of like vacuum left by the Nazis and the Japanese and even the Russians, involved the Central Intelligence Agency in toppling unfriendly governments. These actions would illustrate that the United States had finally cast off its isolationist stance and had become fully involved in the escalating Cold War. For the United States, this is a major shift in American foreign policy. In the past, we've had a tendency to finish wars and come home, dismantle our infrastructure, dismantle our armies, and concentrate on a peace economy. This never happens again. Instead of demobilizing, we remobilize. So by the early 1950s, most of the British colonies in Indonesia were either independent or about to become independent. However, the French and the Dutch, who also had colonies there, were not as willing to grant this status and resisted all efforts. One such area was French Indochina, which was composed of modern-day Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Vietnam's communist forces under leader Ho Chi Minh, he and his forces worked to overthrow the French there. And what had happened was, we get what I refer to sort of cynically as the red flags of Vietnam. And I call them these because there were these critical points in the narrative where the United States had an opportunity to stay out or get out, and we don't. And in large part, this is because of the sort of tunnel vision that was containment and America's Cold War strategy. And so in 1945, when Truman was the president, France actually came to the United States with hat in hand because they wanted the United States to finance and supply a lot of the help for the French to essentially reassert their imperial control over Southeast Asia. Truman's instincts were to go against it. He in fact remarked, why would you do this? You can't even barely afford to, reestablish your own government, right? The new so-called Fifth Republic. What are you doing in Vietnam? And yet, because Ho Chi Minh was labeled as a communist, we went ahead and financed a large part of the French efforts in Southeast Asia. So Ho Chi Minh led his forces to overthrow the French there. And at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, they were able to trap the French forces. This was in 1954, which I think is a second red flag. Much like Germany and Korea, the country Vietnam was divided between a communist North and the Free South. When the French abandoned their endeavors in Southeast Asia, everyone turned to the United States to replace them in that region. Eisenhower now recalled that Ho Chi Minh was fighting, or had fought, on the Allied side during the war. In fact, had been dropped supplies by the United States in order to pin down Japanese forces in Southeast Asia. And Eisenhower was quite perplexed with this sudden change in demeanor towards this, essentially a nationalist, and somebody who had become a communist solely because the French Communist Party pledged to end colonialism. And so Eisenhower is essentially talked out of his instincts by the Dulles brothers and others, who basically drive home this idea that because he's a communist, he's getting support from China and Russia, which he was, there's no question, and that there needed to be a resistance. This leads to what are called the Geneva Accords, and the United States decides to step in as the sponsor for the South Vietnamese regime. They divide the country of the 17th parallel, and the governments in both countries, Hanoi and Saigon, were to prepare their citizens for a UN-sponsored plebiscite to be held in 2 years, which would have been 1956, which I believe is the third big red flag in the Vietnam saga. And this is when the regime in South Vietnam informs the CIA that they had no intention of participating in this vote because they knew they would lose it to Ho Chi Minh. This, in my opinion, is a major red flag, if not the red flag of the saga that is Vietnam. At this point, the United States really should have put on the brakes, because our stated purpose for sponsoring South Vietnam and intervening in Southeast Asia was to promote democracy in the region, and for our chosen government to disparage the democratic process and refuse to participate in it should have been a sign that this was not a winnable scenario. Now, what this does is it convinces the United States to take part in a series of what we're going to call post-war alliances. They are going to involve all sorts of groups of countries in various parts of the globe. There's going to be, here in Southeast Asia, what's called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which is essentially going to be South Vietnam, Australia, and Thailand, and other countries that are going to, the Philippines, although the Philippines are technically still under a large influence of the United States, right? And so the United States installed No Dinh Diem, and the United States sets up these anti-communist alliances all over the world to essentially physically contain communism in its existing system. So now, in 1956, Eisenhower was nominated for the presidency in the I Like Ike campaign. The Democrats nominated Adlai Stevenson again. And added by the crisis in Hungary and in Egypt, right? He's going to have a rather turbulent election year. He suffers a heart attack, if I remember correctly. So in Hungary, the Eastern Europeans go through a confusing and brutal period beginning in 1953 when Stalin died. And the new premier of the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev. As premier, he planned to lessen Stalin's policies of control. In fact, he gives this famous speech at the communist meeting at, I can't remember, where he basically denounced Stalin and essentially says that Stalin's brutality and cruel behavior had made communism unpalatable to large segments of the global population, and that the only way to win that sort of PR war, if you will, is to renounce those tactics and start to become less of a tyrant, particularly when it came to satellite nations, and allow some independence. The Hungarians had a leader named Omri Nagy who announced that he was, initially he asked Khrushchev to remove tanks and stuff from Hungary, which Khrushchev does. And Nagy steps forward with that and essentially announces that Hungary was going to remove itself from the Warsaw Pact in 1956. The result was the invasion of Soviet forces and Nagy's overthrow. In fact, he's taken off to some unmarked area where he's executed and buried in an anonymous grave that's not going to be known until the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. The Hungarian people at that point are going to exhume his body and move it back to Budapest, where there is now, as I understand it, a rather large monument in his honor for his courage in standing up to the Soviets. In this event, the Hungarian people themselves rose up. at the time, the United States had started something called the Voice of America. This was a radio service into Eastern Europe from Western Europe, where the United States had broadcasts in native languages of Eastern Europe, where people could hear American music, mostly rock and roll music and other music, along with coded messages for spies, but also for propaganda messages, which, included, to be honest, some very true stories about what was really going on in the communist system. And in one of these, Eisenhower is quoted as telling the Hungarian people that the West was standing with them, and that they had the support of the American people. Some historians believe that this gave a false message to the Hungarian people that somehow, if they had rose up and taken up the charge against the Russians, that the Americans would step in and help. And of course, that never did happen. And in that same year, we have what's called the Suez War, or the Suez Crisis. In this, the British and the French have a bit of a role here. The most faithful development in the Middle East involved the ownership of the Suez Canal, which connected the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. The newly, I should say, the pharaohs of Egypt were overthrown. King Firuz is overthrown, and a nationalist by the name of Abdel Nasser took over power in what's going to be the Pan-Arab movement. At one point, Egypt is going to link up with Syria to form the United Arab Republic, in the hopes that other Arab countries would join together and be one united Arab force. And so Nasser had wanted West support for the development of electrical power in Egypt, which was going to be done by what's called the Aswan Dam project across the Nile. And this was going to be very expensive, and the West balked. I said the best that I could say here. And so Nasser decided to take over the Suez Canal and use the proceeds collected from the canal to finance the project. Now, this was the Suez Canal was bought and financed by the British and the French, and they resented this assault on what they saw as their property, if you will. And so the French and the British basically antagonized the Israelis by giving them this intelligence that the Egyptians were preparing to invade. So led by commandos from Israel, France and Great Britain attacked the canal to retake it, but were not successful. And they did this without first consulting the United States, assuming that Eisenhower, in his brinksmanship, would relish an opportunity to draw the Soviet Union into the war. The Soviets had given arms to the Egyptians and had started a, let's call it a comfortable relationship, and which is going to last for really 10 years. And yet, Ike demanded that the three countries leave, and they did. And many people initially felt that this was a sign that Eisenhower was weakening, and yet for most Americans, it was a sign of Eisenhower's balanced approach to the war and his desire and ability to de-escalate major crises to prevent them from becoming larger and far more deadly ones. So now Eisenhower gets easily reelected in 1956. Adlai Stevenson is defeated for a second time. And in October of 1957, the Russians launched the first satellite into orbit. Though it was little more than a radio transmitter, Americans were shocked to see the advance of Soviet rocket technology and the ability to put an artificial satellite, into space. And this spurs all kinds of activity in the United States. Most specifically, The federal government, for the first time, is going to inject itself into education, particularly in the teaching of math and science. So for many parts of the country, classes in chemistry, physics, even biology in some areas were just not part of the curriculum. It was expensive, and it was considered not necessary for a population that was predominantly slated for factory work. And Eisenhower's going to change this. He's going to have the Defense of Education Act, where he's going to spend millions, if not, hundreds of millions of dollars on improving schools and promoting the curriculum. In fact, the Advanced Placement Program was basically started as a way of helping schools that didn't have the resources to teach these types of classes, to get these courses actually taught. And so the United States responded by increasing spending on new intercontinental ballistic systems, or ICBMs. NATO members would soon request missiles from the United States in what Eisenhower was going to call the New Look, wherein the U.S. will replace its troops in some places with missiles that could be ready around the clock and be rather threatening. The problem, of course, is that the Russians are going to detonate their own bomb, and the nuclear monopoly is over. But in addition to this, the United States is going to create the National Aeronautic and Space Agency, or NASA, in order to boost its rocket research and technology. The space race is on. So now, let me go back here for just a moment. In order to sort of like discuss the quote-unquote Berlin issue. Now, he had set up barbed wire. He had put up massive patrols of the area. Thousands of people are still going to flee. They're going to dig under their thing. They're going to jump over it. There's all sorts of harrowing videos that you can watch of people escaping into West Berlin. And if you ever travel to Berlin, which is an amazing trip if you can do it, you will see, if you walk around, multiple crosses with people's names on them. And these are all memorials to East Berliners who had lost their lives fleeing for freedom. And Khrushchev sees this as the political relations or public relations nightmare that it was. And so he calls for a summit with the United States. And so the planned summit took a turn for the worse when a U.S. spy plane, a U-2 plane, was shot down over the Soviet Union. When Eisenhower was originally confronted about this, he claimed that there had to be some sort of misunderstanding. The United States doesn't do these sorts of things. It could have been a weather balloon. It could have been this, that, blah, 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 blah. Khrushchev holds a impromptu press conference, unveils wreckage of this spy plane, and then produces Francis Gary Powers, the pilot. So in an unusual act that we seldom see in politics today, Eisenhower went on air, took full responsibility for it, but refused to repudiate the flight. And the American people completely forgave him. It was just like, fine. He just said, look, I didn't tell you. I kept it a secret because it was a matter of national security. I'm sorry that you were misled, but I'm not sorry that we did it. We have to do it for our own safety. And the American people were like, okay, which, just begs why more politicians just don't say they're sorry. So Khrushchev cancels the summit. What happens in the meantime, in 1959, Fidel Castro and his communist forces defeated the Cuban dictator Batista after 2 years of fighting in 1959. Originally, Americans hoped that Castro would reform the government, but soon those hopes were dashed. He instead nationalized all foreign-owned property, of which the majority was American, and redistributed the land. In 1960, Castro signed a trade agreement with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. And the United States reacted to these actions by limiting importation of Cuban goods. Thousands upon thousands of Cubans will be refugees into the United States, which, as you may well know, in Florida particularly, very large Cuban-American population with Little Havana and Miami. And this is the beginning of that decades-long struggle between ourselves and communist Cuba. And so Eisenhower's strategy of massive retaliation and brinksmanship has, in some cases, de-escalated hostilities, but in the grand scheme of things, really never ended any of the problems that were there. And so when we get to the end of the Eisenhower regime, right? Alaska and Hawaii get added to the Union in Eisenhower's second term. The nation also entered a brief economic slump, but it recovers pretty quickly, a very mild recession, I would say. Many of historians at first viewed Ike's presidency of having accomplished very little, but recent scholarship has shed light on the policies and long-lasting evidence that the effects of which we still feel. So he avoided a lot of very volatile issues and deferred on some, particularly in the areas of race. The so-called gloved fist, this idea that, you don't necessarily feel it at first, but it's there. And Eisenhower really didn't want to be confrontational, but he did want things to be done his way. And his presence was always there, even if it wasn't necessarily visible to everyone. And now we're in the 50s, we really start to see shifting political allegiances, particularly when it comes to either the progressive wing of the Republican Party, which will later be referred to as the Rockefeller Republicans, which is actually for a man named Nelson Rockefeller, who will be vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford. These were mostly northeastern Republicans from places like Connecticut and New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts, people with very long histories of loyal Republican support and devotion, who were people who believed that the federal government had to act to handle certain American problems. And this is going to conflict with a lot of the new emerging conservative Republicans who are embracing a sort of states' rights philosophy, an anti-federalist philosophy, really. And they are now going to try to find a new home, many of whom will find it in the Democratic Party. Likewise, in the Democratic Party, we begin to see Southern Democrats question whether they are in the right place. Southern Democrats, from the very beginning of their creation, if you will, back in the early 1800s, have always been an anti-federalist states' rights group. And the Democrats, as of the 1950s, had firmly planted themselves in the federalist philosophy or activism that was more reminiscent of liberal government, that believed in a never-ending expansion of federal power. And for Southern Democrats, that's a tough circle to square. And eventually we will see them move to the Republican Party. So when we look at the 8 years of Eisenhower, many people look back at it with fondness because it was an 8-year period of relative peace and prosperity. There was no direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. There were no escalations into incredibly large conflicts. And, of course, the American economy thrived. But as I had stated earlier, as much as it was a prosperous time, it was an era of good feelings in that the surface seemed really wonderful, but underlying problems would need to be confronted. If not by Eisenhower, then definitely by somebody else. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.